Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's great to see so many of you here. My name is Katie Stanovic, Manager of Individual Philanthropy, and I'm excited to be your host for Food and Water Watch's September Livable Future Live. This afternoon is a celebration. It's been 10 years since we historically banned fracking in New York State. So first and foremost, let's clap, cheer, give some hollers. I know, you know, the nature of our work can make it hard to relish the moments of victory, but this was a major accomplishment. And today we'll get to hear from some of the key Food and Water Watch staff who helped, along with a slew of organizations, coalitions, and activists like all of you here, make the ban a reality. Plus, how it spurred other victories and how we're tackling the fight against fossil fuels today. But before I introduce them, I'm going to give people another couple of minutes to get logged in. And in the meantime, I'll go over some reminders and announcements for upcoming events. Starting with a couple quick Zoom reminders. If you need to turn on closed captioning to add subtitles to your screen, click on the captions button in your Zoom toolbar to turn those on. Keep an eye on the chat box. That's where we'll be sharing some links to resources and ways to take action. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, so if you have questions as you're listening, please add those to the Q&A box. Finally, I am recording this event and we'll share that later this week in a follow-up email, and I'll also include links to the resources we shared today. So before we get started, just a bit of background on Food and Water Watch for those who might be new here. We are a national organization fighting for sustainable food, clean water, and a livable climate for all of us. One of the main ways we do this is by mobilizing grassroots power in communities across the country. Together, we're advocating to reshape our food system, ensure everyone has clean, affordable water, and fighting the fossil fuel industry at every turn. It's thanks to members like all of you here today that we're able to do this work and stand up to powerful industries and corporations who are taking advantage of our communities and our planet. Food and Water Watch doesn't take any corporate money because it's exactly who we're up against in this fight. Corporations with deep pockets. That means it's people like all of you who make this fight possible. If you'd like to make a gift today, you can click the link in the chat or text the word gift to 23321. Finally, I want to share some exciting events we have coming up in the next few months. In October, ahead of the election, our sister organization, Food and Water Action, is going to be hosting some Get Out the Vote events starting every Tuesday, starting October 8th, and then every Tuesday following. Follow the link in the chat to learn more and sign up. Then post-election, we're hosting a Livable Future Live on Wednesday, November 20th from 7 to 8 p.m., where we'll break down what the election results mean for food, water, and climate policy, lay out our plans for the future, and share how you can impact the fight for a livable future for all. The link to register is also in the chat. Now, for today's topic, from New York to California, the fight to ban fracking. 10 years ago, Food and Water Watch, along with incredible allies, did something many critics deemed near impossible. We banned fracking in New York State. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from Food and Water Watch staff who worked on the campaign and what some of their strategies and key moments were in the multi-year effort. We'll also hear how it served as a blueprint in fossil fuel victories across the country and how together we continue to fight fracking today. And with that, I will introduce our speakers. First, we have Emily Wurth, Managing Director of Organizing, who has been with Food and Water Watch for 18 years. Emily helped organize and worked closely with the New Yorkers Against Fracking Coalition. Welcome, Emily. And next we have Alex Beauchamp, Northern Region Director, who has been with Food and Water Watch for 15 years. Alex oversaw the organizing for the New York Fracking campaign and played a central role in the New Yorkers Against Fracking Coalition. Thanks for joining us, Alex. And last, but certainly not least, Eric Weltman is here, Brooklyn-based senior organizer with Food and Water Watch, who has been with the organization for 14 years. Eric worked tirelessly on the fracking campaign in New York from day one. I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. We will have time for questions at the end, so as you're listening, if you have one, please add them to the Q&A box. And with that, I would just like to get started at the very beginning. Eric, Alex, and Emily, how did Food and Water Watch get involved?
Yeah, thanks so much, Katie. I'll jump in here first. And before I answer your question, I just want to start by saying that this was a huge, vibrant, multi-year campaign. So we won't possibly be able to describe everything that went into it to make this ban possible in the time we have together today. But we first got involved as Food and Water Watch in opposing fracking because we heard from our members on the ground. They were concerned in Pennsylvania and New York. And we had recently written a report on the threat to our nation's groundwater. And so we started getting calls from members in Pennsylvania and New York who were concerned about fracking as a serious threat to our groundwater. At that time, we didn't work much on energy issues, and we actually hadn't taken a position on fracking because of that. And so we decided we would start by doing some research. And we wrote our first report in 2010 called Not So Fast Natural Gas. And that really went into how poorly regulated the industry was at the federal level, and that it had what's coined the Halliburton loophole, named after the corporation that pioneered fracking, that exempted it from our landmark environmental regulations like the Safe Drinking Water Act, among others. Um, so we detailed that in the report, and the report literally flew off the shelves. And that's when we realized, wow, there's really a lot of interest in this issue. Yeah.
So we took our lead and our inspiration from grassroots and indigenous activists in New York, many of whom had learned about the dangers of fracking from Gasland, an incredible documentary made by Josh Fox, which came out in the year 2010 and was nominated for an Academy Award. In the course of the campaign, we organized dozens and dozens of screenings of the film ourselves. But early on, a lot of people had never heard of fracking. In fact, I can credibly claim to be the first person who told New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand about it. It was at a public forum on the Farm Bill held in the Bronx, and at first she didn't believe me when I described what fracking was. It was so bizarre and horrific. When I finally convinced her, she was suitably disturbed, and she said to me, "I'm going to call Andy," meaning then Governor Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah, as Eric and our organizers at the time in New York just were getting more and more involved in fracking, it just became clear that this was something that was really widely and deeply felt by the people in New York. And that's when we thought we really need to get more involved. I remember covering a training that Eric was in Chicago for a training, and I covered this event at SUNY Albany. I think it was during the winter. It was on a Saturday morning, and the auditorium held hundreds of people, and hundreds of people came to this session where we were talking about the state environmental impact statement and the flaws with it. And I just realized that, wow, this is a powerful grassroots movement, and they don't want fracking to come to New York. So we took action from that. And in 2011, we really decided we should follow the lead of the grassroots and come out in support of a national ban on fracking. We did that at 2011. We released our report called The Case for a Ban on Fracking at a press conference in New York. And we became the first national environmental organization to call for a ban on fracking. And we distributed tens of thousands of printed copies. At that time, people still wanted printed copies of reports. And we did a follow-up called The Urgent Case for a Ban on Fracking, which I think we're including a link to in the chat here. And like I said, that was just really popular among activists across the country who supported a ban on fracking.
So early on, there were a lot of organizations that were suitably alarmed by fracking's potential threat to New York, but took varying positions on it. The mainstream environmental organizations generally accepted that fracking would be allowed in the state, so they maintained that we had to ensure that strong regulations were in place. And Food and Water Watch did collaborate with these groups, particularly on big tent rallies in Albany, the state capital. And at one of these huge rallies, I was invited to speak, and the MC, Wes Gillingham from Catskill Mountain Keeper, a tremendous ally of ours, randomly, or so he said, chose me to speak first. I led the crowd in a chant of "Ban fracking now" that shook the roof and set the tone for the event because it reflected where the activists were on the issue. They didn't want to regulate fracking, they wanted to ban it. That's where the energy was, and it powered our movement to victory.
Yeah, that's maybe a good segue to forming the New Yorkers Against Fracking Coalition. So as as Eric just mentioned, right, at the time in the press, between environmental groups, with elected officials, there was this focus on how do we regulate fracking, right? Not whether to allow it, but how best to allow it. To the point where a bunch of mainstream environmental groups at the time were on a task force that Andrew Cuomo created to look at how to best regulate the practice, right? And as Eric mentioned, when you talk to everyday, New Yorkers on the ground, no one was talking about that, right? No one wanted to hear about how far away these wells should be from our schools. The thing they wanted to hear about is, should we allow this or not? That disconnect was super clear to us, and we and a bunch of our allies formed New Yorkers Against Fracking to change that, right? Because while people were saying that on the ground, it wasn't really represented in the halls of Albany. So when I moved to New York in 2012, it was right as we were organizationally began to put more resources into fracking, and right after this powerful coalition, New Yorkers Against Fracking, was created by us at Food and Water Watch, but also our friends at Frack Action, at Catskill Mountain Keeper, who Eric just mentioned, Citizen Action of New York. And we formed this in conjunction with the incredible academic and activist Sandra Steingraber, who just won a Heinz Award for her amazing environmental work and generously donated the prize to kind of jumpstart the coalition and get the thing off the ground. And I remember clearly right after I moved to New York in 2012, the next weekend we went to this huge, not huge, but this long retreat, weekend long thing. And I met everybody. And my initial reaction was like, these people are amazing. Together we can make this happen. It was and remains a really, really intense group of people. But to me, right from that moment on, it was just sort of off and running and for years. And really can't stress enough how important that coalition was. None of us could have done that alone, right? It was through a bunch of groups working together. The groups I mentioned, and also NYPIRG, who came in a little bit later. So
and
together,
United for Action on the ground in New York too was critical. Yeah,
totally. Yeah. So together we were too powerful for the governor to ignore, and by ourselves, none of us would have been.
Cool. So after y'all formed the coalition, what were some of the strategies that were at the heart of the work that Food and Water Watch did?
Well, there were 5 essential elements to the campaign, and I'll enumerate them and then describe them in a little more detail. First, we built a massive movement. Second, we demanded what we wanted, or what we needed, actually. We targeted Cuomo, we were unrelenting, and we made it about health. And those elements are detailed in an article that I actually published in the magazine In These Times soon after the victory. But I'll briefly describe them now. So first, the movement was massive. It stretched from Long Island to Buffalo and just about everywhere in between. And it was diverse, including networks of health professionals, of businesses, local elected officials, chefs, and faith leaders. One wow moment for me was a campaign meeting we held in our office in Brooklyn that included surfers and farmers against fracking. Quite a combination. Again, we demanded what we wanted, a complete ban on fracking, despite efforts to divide us. So, for example, when the Cuomo administration proposed to keep fracking out of some regions of New York, but not ban it statewide, our response was immediate, it was strong, and it was united. Not one well. In fact, we took out a full-page ad in the New York Times to clearly convey this message and worked to ensure that none of the environmental groups would go along with this plan. We made it about Cuomo. He was the decision maker. He was the decider. I remember one memorable meeting to discuss strategy in the midst of a somewhat tiresome debate. The head of New York's Working Families Party, Dan Cantor, he pounded his fist on the table to emphasize his point. The strategy, he said simply, was Cuomo, Cuomo, Cuomo. And so he made it clear in every message, every statement, every action, it was not some government agency that would decide. It was Governor Andrew Cuomo. Fourth, we were unrelenting, engaging in scores of conventional tactics like calling Governor Cuomo every week. In fact, What we called Call Cuomo Mondays was a tactic divided by our very dear friend David Braun from United for Action, again, a key ally in the city, and petition deliveries. But we engage in some unconventional tactics too, like what we call bird dogging, which involved showing up at Cuomo's public appearances to embarrass him, engage his supporters, and generate media attention. One memorable action amongst many involved getting up at the crack of dawn to surprise Cuomo at his polling location in Westchester when he showed up to vote, was joined by his supporters, family, and a slew of media. Um, and then finally, we made it about health. Folks, this was not some abstract environmental issue impacting trees and polar bears, so we certainly do love those too. This is about protecting the health and safety of our families and our communities. It was about protecting our water, protecting our food, protecting our air. And in fact, we worked very closely with Dr. Sandra Steingraber and other members of concerned health professionals in New York to convey the very real risks that fracking posed to our health, amplifying each new study. And there were an abundance of such studies that showed the harms.
Yeah, that's totally right. Eric mentioned this. We were really, really unrelenting towards the governor at the time, and part of that was the bird dogging effort he just mentioned. I want to just share a couple stories of that because I think it was this really impactful thing we did over years and years. And first, I want to give you a sense of the scale, right? So at the height of the campaign, we were doing 25 of these a year. So this is going outside as many of the governor's events as we possibly could. So it's like every other week. And it ranged from really huge, like 1,000 people rallies for ones we had a lot of notice for, to like a couple dozen of us when sometimes we had 6 hours notice because the governor started giving less and less notice to his public events, I think in large part because of the fracking activists. So a couple of the most memorable ones for me, one is we had several thousand people at the State of the State, multiple different years actually. So this is the biggest speech the governor gives. For those not in New York, kind of akin to the State of the Union, but at the state level. And we had thousands of people flooding the halls in Albany. And what was amazing is lobbyists and almost every elected official have to walk by this hall to get into the speech. And so they sort of hear this like loud crowd echoing ban fracking now over and over and over again for hours through the kind of marble halls. Really, really important moment, I think, of the campaign. One other really fun one, we tried to be outside as many of the governor's fundraisers as we could. And one really memorable one to me, we were outside a fundraiser, I think it was December. He always had a December birthday fundraiser. And it was at the Waldorf Astoria. We had a ton of people there, and the cops were really kind of harassing us. They didn't want us there. They said, you can't be on the sidewalk, you're blocking traffic. And so we said, okay, we're going to make this a moving picket. No one's blocking the sidewalk. We're all moving. And there were so many people there. We encircled the Waldorf Astoria. So everyone coming to the fundraiser had to get by us. And I think most memorably, the governor's father, who's now passed away, Mario Cuomo, was there. He shows up to his son's fundraiser and kind of hesitates, sees this line of activists and sort of watches them, and then all of a sudden darts between them to get in the door. I think that's illustrative of why we did this stuff, right? None of this was just because it was fun, although it really was. We did this not because any of these one actions would convince the governor, but that by doing it over and over and over again over a period of years, you kept the issue at the front of mind, and it sent a signal that this anti-fracking movement simply won't go away. And to me was one of the more exciting parts of the campaign.
Yeah. So even though, I mean, you just said it was so many events in one and not just something specific, I am curious, do you feel like there was a specific moment or action that did turn that tide?
Well, we probably all have different answers for this. I always think back to a key moment. It was actually a little bit earlier on in the campaign, but it was just after we had formed the New Yorkers Against Fracking Coalition, and we held a rally and press conference at the kind of iconic $1 Million Staircase in the Capitol in Albany. And it was packed crowd. We were doing a press conference, and Mark Ruffalo, who had just starred in one of the Avengers movies, we were very fortuitous with our timing, came there, and we had people whose water had been contaminated, endemic, and families were there as well, speaking at the event. You can see in this picture Mark holding up their water. But there were just dozens of TV cameras and media outlets there because of Mark Ruffalo and his fame. But it was just a really, really powerful rally and press conference. And it was immediately followed by this amazing event that Natalie Merchant, a musician, helped organize a concert with poetry and musicians and speakers at the venue right next to the Capitol called The Egg. Some of you in New York have probably seen it. It's very iconic. And all of this incredible concert was filmed by filmmaker John Bowermaster and then turned into a film called Dear Governor Cuomo. And we were later able to do film screenings and educate more people about the problems with fracking across the state from that. But it was just really an incredible day of event, and you could really feel the energy behind the movement. And I just had this feeling like we can win this. So.
Yeah, there were so many moments like this. One particular one that comes to mind was another bird dogging action. Our very first on Long Island, along with our allies at NYPIRG, we very quickly mobilized a few dozen people to rally outside of a drumstick factory that Cuomo was touring. Yeah, the drumsticks like you be on a drum with. He was touring this drumstick factory, and I snuck into the event, and I saw Cuomo being interviewed by reporters. And it was obvious that he was stunned. And I mean, he was visibly shocked to find anti-fracking protesters on Long Island, hundreds of miles from where any fracking would actually occur. Another powerful moment for me was when Cuomo held a reading of a book he had authored, I guess, at a bookstore in Union Square. We learned about it in advance and mobilized a rally outside the store. Folks, we had twice as many people outside as were inside for the book reading. Now, I wouldn't say that that one event turned the tide, but it certainly signified to me, and perhaps to Cuomo, that we were a force to be reckoned with, and they risked inflicting serious damage to his political career if he allowed fracking in New York. And finally, I'll mention this massive rally we held at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. This was early in the campaign before the coalition was launched, New Yorkers Against Fracking, in February of 2012. Folks, we packed the cathedral, which is actually the world's largest. It's gorgeous too, on the Upper West Side with nearly 1,000 people. A lot of elected officials and progressive leaders in attendance were amazed that so many people from the city cared so much about fracking. And I think this event played an instrumental role in getting other groups to get invested in the issue.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree. For me, I think I already mentioned the state of the state rallies. One particular one that, because there were several of these, but one that I remember really well was Pete Seager, towards the end of his life, showed up. And there was a moment to me where like he shows up and you can sort of see it in the photo. There was like a million cameras there. There's a huge crowd behind him. There's something about the energy of that day where I thought like, oh my God, I think we can win this. So that was exciting. One other big moment for me, there were a million of these different public comment periods that I can't bore you all with, but one of them, maybe the ultimate one, I guess, we gathered over 200,000 comments, and we were going to deliver them in this big event in Albany. And as you can see, Yoko Ono here and her son, Sean Lennon, who had recently come out against fracking, they showed up with us with these boxes of comments. I remember this clearly because I was driving these boxes around Albany in a U-Haul because we'd stuffed all of them. Really difficult to get into the Capitol. I walk into the room where the press conference is set up. We set up the boxes, and I turn around and realize, like, oh my God, every reporter in the state seemingly is here. And that was another moment, I think, where just the energy was so exciting. And then lastly, I think the single biggest event we held probably was called the Crossroads Rally. It was a massive thing we did in the summer. I think the summer following that comment delivery, several thousand people just flooding the streets of Albany, encircling the Capitol. And I remember when I came up to speak, looking out at the crowd and thinking like, okay, this is serious. This is like more people than we've had even at all these big fracking events. And so I think was another key moment where I thought like, okay, this is something we can do.
That's incredible. I mean, all those different things that come together to get a win. And so just after you all had put in, as Emily said, years into this effort, where were you when you heard the news that the ban had been passed, and what did that feel like?
Yeah. I mean, Eric and I were both in the Brooklyn office with a bunch of our colleagues. So we were watching. I think it's important for the story to know, like, we didn't know what was going to happen, right? We knew they were going to make a fracking announcement. They start the press conference. A lot of us at the time were worried about some kind of pilot project. So anyway, they start talking and talking and talking. And there's a moment where the health commissioner of New York says, I had to ask myself, would I want my children? It turned out later that he didn't have children, but my my theoretical children to live near a fracking site. And when I look at the evidence, the answer has to be no. And a bunch of it had been like I don't know, half an hour at this point, but a bunch of us I remember looked at each other and thought like, oh my God, they're going to ban it. Like you can't say that and then say here's how we'll regulate it. So that was really, really exciting. And then even before that was over, I think we started to realize like, wow, we got to do some stuff. And so we rushed with our coalition partners in New Yorkers Against Fracking and a bunch of others to put out a statement in the city. Eric and I and a bunch of others organized a really rapid last kind of bird dog effort on fracking. We went to the governor's office for like the zillionth time. And this time he actually showed up and thanked the activists for their effort. And it's really kind of like a funny, surreal moment for all of us who've been hounding the guy forever and ever, and he'd been avoiding us. And then all of a sudden he just sort of like shows up when we're outside his office. So that was really great. So anyway, that's where we were.
Couple of things. One, I want to note that when we were watching that event, Cuomo rather innocently turned to his health commissioner and said, so I hear you've been studying fracking. What have you concluded? As if, right? I mean, you could barely go to the bathroom in Albany without Cuomo's permission, but he feigned complete innocence and, unawareness of this decision he had told the commissioner to make. I will acknowledge when I heard the decision, I called my wife up on my cell phone and I cried. Yeah, it was a great moment.
It was great. I remember that day clearly. I was in our DC office watching the same press conference after receiving the flurry of emails Alex alluded to, that everyone was, hearing rumors that they were going to allow fracking in the southern tier. So it seems inevitable now, but at the time we really had no idea, what they were going to announce. So I literally screamed out loud and all my colleagues came running down the hallway and we celebrated together. So yeah, it was a very great feeling.
Yeah, everything must come to a head at that time, and the varying emotions make sense, and something screaming, crying, it all kind of checks out. So after, that happened, can you share some of the biggest lessons learned that we've used, we being Food and Water Watch, in later successful fights?
Yeah, sure. To me, I think the key lesson, or one key lesson, is to just fight for what you want rather than what others tell you is politically possible. I think that's really a thing that runs a through line through all of Food and Water Watch's work. We really look at like, what is it going to take to solve the problem, not what can we get. I think that's really, really important. And then I think the other thing that we've like hammered home a lot, so I won't belabor, is we just have to be relentless. And we really, really were on this one.
Yeah, there's so many lessons. I think the points Eric made up front is identifying a clear target, having a clear demand that you're asking for, and really building and demonstrating, all the people power to that target. But when I reflect on this campaign, I think what I learned is the importance in believing that it's possible to win. And not giving up because other people tell you it isn't possible. And there was just a really remarkable group of people at the heart of the New York fracking movement who believed it was possible to win. And that was just contagious. And they spread that to everyone around us. And that's why so many people gave up, and so many people on this call likely gave up so much of their free time and energy to make that happen. And I don't think we talk about that enough, that we have to believe it's possible to win, to actually win. And this campaign showed that you can take on the powerful fossil fuel industry and its entrenched political power, and together we can win.
Absolutely. So keeping in line with that, we can win, that mentality, and moving forward, can you share some of the other victories or, that forward progress we've been able to achieve with the fracking ban as our launching pad?
Yeah, I mean, the New York fracking campaign really helped launch the national and played a critical role in the international movement against fracking, and just led to so many victories against fossil fuel infrastructure all across the country. But I always think of the immediate benefit to the campaign of keeping fracking out of Maryland, because that's where I live. It's my home state. Maryland was really similar to New York in that it had shale gas reserves. The same Marcellus Shale went through Western Maryland, but fracking hadn't started yet in the state. And in November of 2014, 1 month before this announcement by the Cuomo administration to ban fracking in New York, Larry Hogan, who at the time was a completely unknown businessman, surprisingly won the Maryland gubernatorial election. And he'd campaigned on fracking being a gold mine, he called it, for the state. And in response to him winning and having been so aggressively pro-fracking, the outgoing term-limited Democratic Governor O'Malley kind of frantically indicated his support for what he called gold standard fracking regulations to be put in place in Maryland. He was having an advisory body study it and hadn't made any decision. And many of the major environmental groups in Maryland just kind of lined up in support of that and thought, okay, we'll pass a bill to regulate fracking in the next session right away. However, we and some of our grassroots allies and public health allies realized, wait, here's our opening to get the legislature, which in Maryland was supermajority in both the House and the Senate, to actually take action on fracking. They had been using this advisory body as a reason not to take any action. So we talked to our allies in the public health community and some of the grassroots and decided we'd push for a moratorium, given all the health studies that were coming out, to give us more time to organize for a ban. And we'd built support, but we did not have the support of the key groups in Western Maryland where land was actually being leased to frack, and we needed their support. And then the news came that New York was banning fracking, and it was the inspiration for them to decide, we can take this risk and try to keep fracking out of our state. If New York can do it, we can do it too. So we went on to pass a 2.5-year moratorium in April of 2015, and then 2 years later, a full ban on fracking before the moratorium expired. And a whole nother story is how Governor Hogan ended up supporting that fracking ban, but we don't have time to go into that today. So I don't know if any of that would have happened without this kind of fortuitous timing of the New York ban. So our campaigns are interconnected.
Yeah, that's a good point. In New York, I think the power dynamics really changed after we banned fracking. So up to that point, the state, under Republican and Democratic governors, had approved a bunch of fracked gas pipelines, power plants, kind of like gas infrastructure writ large, right? We were just losing those over and over and over again. And I think that after the fracking ban, the power dynamics just shifted, right? You can't win the oil and gas industry back at that point if you're Cuomo. And I think you'd also seen the power of the anti-fracking movement. And that's not to say we won everything since. We've lost some too. But since then, we've stopped. And I say we broadly, not all Food and Water Watch, but this whole broad coalition and all of the people, many of whom I'm sure on the call, who've been fighting so hard to stop these. We've stopped one pipeline after another. 1 year after the fracking ban, we killed this thing called Port Ambrose, which was a massive LNG facility off the coast of Long Island. If you follow any of the liquefied natural gas stuff, those are really tough fights to win, and we haven't won a lot of them around the country. And then since then, we've now moved on to power plants and increasingly to buildings. We've banned gas and fossil fuels in newly constructed buildings, first at the city level and now statewide. So you can think of all that, I think, as downstream from the extraction itself. But none of it, I think, could have happened without the fracking ban coming first. So I think that's really important. And then I wanted to say just a couple words about Pennsylvania, just because it's been in the news a lot. And despite what you might read in the paper or hear in the debates, Pennsylvanians are not sort of uniformly for fracking. And in fact, our colleagues in Pennsylvania have made an enormous progress since the fracking ban in New York in that state. So last year, we banned fracking in Allegheny County parks. Allegheny is the county that contains Pittsburgh and the surrounding suburbs. That was a big deal because the industry was really targeting the parks and had already fracked some of them. Really, really big, celebrating the 1 year anniversary of that as we celebrate this 10-year anniversary. We've also done a lot of amazing work hyper locally there. So, it's really difficult to ban fracking locally using those words. What you can do, though, is change zoning ordinances to make it basically impossible to frack. We've done that to a pretty amazing degree in Southwest Pennsylvania. I think there's 34 municipal ordinances we've passed, effectively taking land off the table in and around Allegheny County. And then really excitingly, we just passed a county ban on injection wells, which you don't have time to go into, but is like the waste product of fracking. And no one, Republican or Democrat, likes that. So that's all really exciting. And I think a sign that this movement is growing, even in places where the media sometimes portrays it as not so much. So yeah, excited about all that work.
And another state that really got momentum from the New York fracking ban is California. And despite our perception that it's an environmental leader, it's the 7th leading oil producer in the country right now. And so in Californians Against Fracking, a coalition launched shortly after this in California, and there was so much work that was done at the local level, passing, I think, bans in 6 counties. There were measures passed. There's been so much work. There's no way to detail it in this short amount of time, but there have been local measures to take on oil production in Ventura County, where we've worked for a long time, Los Angeles. And I should just mention that we've worked really closely with leaders on the front line and the environmental justice community directly impacted by urban oil drilling and potentially fracking in the state. And there were everything from huge statewide actions and campaigns to bird dog multiple governors, Jerry Brown and now Governor Newsom. So just a tremendous amount of work over many, many years. Though it took longer than anyone hoped, in 2021, Governor Newsom did announce that he was going to ban fracking, but that it would not go into effect until 2024. So in February of this year, he followed through on this promise that the state released the rule to ban fracking in California. And we're still waiting for them to finalize that rule. But I do think this larger public narrative on fracking being banned in New York in 2014, Maryland 2017, Washington State banned it in 2019, along with the really intensifying impacts of climate in the state. And again, the tremendous organizing and leadership from the environmental justice organizations and people impacted by oil drilling in communities in California really helped push Governor Newsom to do this. And I will say we'll closely be monitoring the finalization of the state rules so we can officially add California to the list of states that have banned fracking.
Yeah, I know someone in the chat had asked how many states at this point have banned fracking. So I know that's something if someone can answer, I don't even know if I know the exact number myself. Hopefully one of my colleagues here know it. But just all of that work and the forward progress that we've been able to do. But as we all know, there's always work to be done. Are there any key projects that Food and Water Watch is focusing on going forward?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's very similar in New York is that this year there was this crazy proposal to frack with carbon dioxide to get around the fracking ban. So the idea is like we'll use carbon dioxide instead of water. This is crazy, has all the same risks of fracking. But one cool thing is it sort of allowed us to get the band back together. So working in close concert with our allies, notably Frack Action, but too many to list off here. We very quickly fought back and really quickly passed a bill through both houses. I can't stress how unusual that is in Albany, but we did it. Unfortunately, Governor Hochul is yet to sign that bill. She has till the end of the year to do it. We're cautiously optimistic she will, but I believe there's an action alert that someone can throw in the chat. So for those in New York, it'd be helpful to tell her to sign that bill. That's one very obvious thing because it literally is fracking. And then we're also continuing our work, to move the state off fossil fuels and specifically off gas. So we want to go bigger on buildings to get gas out of all existing buildings, which is a much harder step, but really excited about that work. And one piece of that is passing a bill called New York Heat that we got really, really close last year. I won't bore everybody with the details, but we think this coming legislative session, starting in 2025, we can win that. So that's really exciting. New Jersey, just across the river, is in a really interesting sort of similar place. So they have an Empower NJ coalition that's working to fight. There isn't like fracking itself in New Jersey, right? There's no shale, but there are a lot of pipelines, power plants, the same kind of campaign I just ran through in New York. Really excited about that work. We've killed several power plants in the last year, but there's a bunch of other fossil fuel projects, and they're kind of fighting that tooth and nail. And I already mentioned Pennsylvania quickly. I guess the last thing I'd say is we did all that local work, like municipality by municipality. We just kicked off a really exciting campaign to ban fracking outright in Allegheny County, like countywide. This would be a huge deal. The industry is trying to frack there. And I think we're close. I mean, it's going to be a huge fight. It's probably going to be a 2-year long effort, but we're really excited about that work as well.
Great. And nationally, obviously, the outcome of this election is going to have a huge impact on what we can accomplish at the federal level in the coming year. And I'm sure we don't need to say anything to you all about how critical this election is for our climate. I can say we hope to have a political environment in the new year where we can push for stronger action to take on the fossil fuel industry. That includes ending subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, stopping new LNG exports, reinstating the ban on crude oil export lifted under the Obama administration, and stopping new leases on public lands. Those would just be some places we could start. In the meantime, we're working with allies to monitor what we coined the dirty deal permitting reform legislation that Senator Manchin is still trying to push through before his retirement. And thanks in part to probably many of you on this call, we've stopped previous iterations of this bill. It's bad. It would increase oil and gas extraction on public lands, allow the LNG. It's kind of the opposite of what we want to do, allow LNG approvals regardless of their climate or public health impacts. It would facilitate more easy construction of fossil fuel infrastructure, and also would weaken the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which is one of our critical environmental regulations. So we're pushing on key targets in the Senate, including Senator Schumer, to keep this bill from moving. We're phone banking into the office and always welcome anyone who wants to help us with that through our volunteer program. And we're really working to keep this from being attached to must-pass legislation. This has been their strategy to move these unpopular bills, is to attach them to, we're watching the appropriations bill that has to pass to fund the government. And this could also come up in the lame duck session as well. So we'll be monitoring that closely as well and providing ways for people to get involved. And one last fight in California, we found out recently that we expect to hear a decision on something we've been working on for close to a decade. We're hoping to hear a timeline for the shutdown of the Aliso Canyon gas storage facility. Aliso Canyon had a catastrophic blowout in 2015, the largest methane blowout in US history. This displaced thousands of families and sickened nearby residents in the Porter Ranch community of the San Fernando Valley in LA. And health issues have persisted for these communities. Cancer and asthma rates have increased. It's really awful. So we are awaiting the recommendation of a timeline for the shutdown from the California Public Utilities Commission. We expect this to come in late October, and we're hoping for the best outcome, which would be shutting this down in 2027. And so we'll be monitoring this closely, generating as many comments and a steady drumbeat of phone calls to the governor's office on this issue. And it's just going to be a major priority for our California team through the end of the year. So just thought I'd mention that. And we hope to have good news before the end of the year.
Amazing. Thank all three of you, Eric, Emily, and Alex, for sharing your stories, how y'all did it, about the organizations that we worked with, what those lessons learned were. I mean, it truly is a feat. And so I think being able to look back and celebrate those wins and know that we can win, like you were saying, Emily, just powers our movement forward in all these ways that we're working across the country and will continue to be working. So with a little bit of time now, we're gonna take some questions that we've had in the audience. And so let's see, a first one that we're gonna start with is, what is a possible replacement or energy alternative to natural gas at large, or even just in someone's home? I don't know if Emily, Alex, or Eric, you feel strong about answering that.
Well, renewable energy, wind and solar are the alternative. And I think, the science shows we need to move off of all fossil fuels, including natural gas. The industry tried to pitch that it was cleaner than coal, and we know that's not true. And there's new studies coming out. I think our allies at Oil Change released a report yesterday talking about all the methane that's being released from the oil and gas industry and the how damaging that is to our climate. So we need to aggressively build out and invest in renewable energy. And obviously at Food and Water Watch, we advocate for policy level solutions to do that. So we're working really hard at the state level. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Alex, with New York and where we're at with that climate plan there.
Well, I've got
Yeah,
a
I mean,
couple of
Or Eric, go
Oh.
ahead. Sorry, Eric.
no, go ahead, Eric. Sorry.
I've got a couple of things to note. One, I was often asked that question in the midst of the fight to ban fracking. What's the alternative? And the response I like to give was, well, there are safer alternatives to natural gas, but there are no alternatives to water. Right. But the second thing I'll note is one of the victories that Food and Water Watch helped achieve a couple of years ago here in New York is passage of something called the Build Public Renewables Act. New York is home to the state's largest publicly owned electric utility. It was started by FDR back when he was governor of New York, and we believe that NYPA, the New York Power Authority, has the capacity to really unleash a tremendous amount of potential and capacity for building out the renewables that we need to meet our climate goals here in New York. So I think that's something that, at least, a tool that we have here in New York State is this tremendous public power authority that has the expertise and the tools and capacity and the financing necessary to build out what we need in terms of renewables.
And I mean, in terms of people's homes, obviously that, there's expenses involved with all of that, but we should mention that there is funding available. It's not nearly what we think it should be, but through the Inflation Reduction Act, there are rebates, and not all the states have, I know, opted into that yet, but there are opportunities for, converting, if you have a gas stove, to induction or electric, and likewise with heating systems. But obviously, like I said, we advocate for policy level solutions because we know not everyone has the means to do that. But if you do, there's great. And there's obviously indoor air quality issues around, cooking with gas that have become more known to in terms of the contamination indoors, especially if you're not using a ventilation. And so a lot of people are thinking about that as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thinking back to, 10 years ago, there's a question about how you all worked with other organizations. So it seems like such a strong community was built. And Alex, you're even referencing that the band is back together. But how was it maintaining and working with such wide ranges of groups?
I mean, Eric and Emily, I'm sure you have thoughts too. To me, the thing that made it work is that we set it up the right way, right? So, like, not to say that there wasn't conflict, of course there is with any group of people, but what held the thing together is a couple of things. One, everybody agreed from the beginning, the point of this coalition was to call for a ban. So, like, if that wasn't you, right, if that's not where your group was, then you just weren't in it. I think that was really, really important. We also limited it to that, right? So, like, we all work on other stuff. A bunch of us have worked together since, but during that campaign, it was laser focused. Like, we're working to ban fracking. We're not getting distracted of the other million things we could do. And some of us had to do other stuff simultaneously. But I think narrowing it and having the goal be really, really explicit was important. And then third, I think all those groups, right? Us, Frack Action, Catskill Mountain Keeper, NYPIRG, everybody has a real focus on people power, on bringing people out. And I guess as a similar theory of change, to use this sort of like jargony term, we all thought the way we were going to win this was with people power going straight at the governor. And I think that makes it all kind of hang together. Like, we all had a shared vision of how we were going to do it, and all had the resources and the expertise to like actually do that, right? Everybody pulled their own weight. And I think that really mattered. So I think those are the key things, at least at the top of my head.
Eric or Emily, I don't know if you feel anything else on that.
No, I think that's all right. And just that we highlighted all the different constituencies who cared about this issue. And so we saw that level of diversity as the strength. And so, you know, we worked with vintners and the Finger Lakes and brewers and, you know, chefs and farmers and, like Eric said, surfers. And, you know, there were all kinds of different groups that were engaged, the health professionals, obviously, but, you know, we'd have signs at events and people could fill in the blank of, you know, however they identified themselves against fracking. And so I think with the New Yorkers Against Fracking frame, and then kind of just wanting everyone to join in the constituency that they represented, that we kind of tried to intentionally play to the strength of that, of how many different types of people were worried about this issue and didn't want it in New York. And so that was a strength, I think.
Great. And then let's see. After talking about New York, you all were just mentioning the CO2 fracking that they're trying to kind of use as a loophole. You know, are there other ways of fracking that are out there? Like, what does it look like when other things start popping up that might kind of go against what we've already made progress toward?
There've been at least one other attempt. So there's this crazy idea to use gelled propane instead of water, which is sort of the same genre of trying to get around it. That never went anywhere, and we killed it pretty quickly. I think something like that, someone could propose something like that again. I think narrowly on fracking in New York, you know, we're committed to being vigilant and fighting it, whatever comes up. But I think we're at a place where it'd be politically really, really hard to do. I think if you zoom out, though, that is what we're seeing, right? Like if you just think of the energy picture in general, we've kind of burned all the easy coal and gas and all of the easy stuff we can extract from the earth. And so what you're seeing are more and more extreme extraction methods. It's hard to predict the future, but I think we can predict that, right? There are going to be some other heinous, environmentally destructive way to get at fossil fuels that the companies couldn't get to before. I think that's exceedingly likely. And so I think that just sort of underscores the importance of building a movement to stop all fossil fuel projects across the board, because more extreme energy extraction, that almost certainly is going to keep happening.
And one of the, you know, the ironies of the proposal for CO2 fracking here in New York was the intention was to use CO2 that was captured from the burning of fossil fuels. So, you know, in some ways, this gets to the broader question about, you know, false solutions to climate change, which certainly includes carbon capture here in New York. The governor's starting to talk about, you know, nuclear power as a means of meeting our climate goals. I mean, these are all, you know, fantasies, you know, dangerous, expensive fantasies, you know, inspired by the corporate lobbyists that, you know, stand to gain from them. So I think in a broader sense, we need to, you know, keep our government, you know, laser focused on proven, safer solutions that are reliable, that are dependable, and that don't, you know, don't require, you know, massive amounts of subsidies to the corporations that would stand to gain from them.
Thank you. We are coming up on time. I just wanted to ask if Eric, Emily, and Alex had any final thoughts to share with the group, to share with everybody listening. Ban fracking now. That will always be what Eric has to say. But any final thoughts before we start to transition out?
Well, just that we probably should have spent more time thanking everybody. I know a lot of people on this call helped us do this, right? And helped the movement do it and are still fighting fossil fuels one way or another. So anyway, thanks for all your work. It works.
And by the way, speaking of thanking people, one of the things I realized that I think didn't do adequately. We had the example of Pennsylvania next door to us. I mean, I think that was instrumental. That was absolutely instrumental. If New York were, you know, thousands of miles away, that would have been a different story. But we were welcomed by so many incredible activists who are still suffering the consequences of fracking in Pennsylvania, and we organized, you know, numerous bus trips and activists and allies as well. And I think, you know, learning from these tremendous activists, courageous activists in Pennsylvania. I mean, that would take an hour just to list out all of them, but I want to note that.
Absolutely.
Well, on the note of thanks, thank you to you three for being here with us today, sharing your stories and for the work that all three of you did 10 years ago and continuing today. To hear firsthand was really inspiring. And so I personally thank you. If you in the chat or watching want to learn more, read some interviews with our volunteers at the time, or see some more pictures, you can read our fall Livable Future Now. So that'll be dropped in the chat for you here. And before we all head off this afternoon, I just want to share a few opportunities to be part of what we talked about today. So there are tons of ways you can get involved with Food and Water Watch as a volunteer. We have local teams in many states across the country, and we also have a national team and issue-focused teams working on things like food, water, climate, and plastic, which you can be a part of no matter where you live. A great place to start is our monthly first-time volunteer action call, which happens every month, and our volunteer leaders can help you plug into opportunities you're most excited about. And then next, just another quick reminder to join us in October with our sister organization, Food and Water Action, where we'll be phone baking for Get Out the Vote and turning some of our election anxiety into action. That link is in the chat. And then post-election, we'll be hosting a special Livable Future Live on Wednesday, November 20th from 7 to 8 p.m., where we'll break down what the election results mean for food, water, and climate policy and lay out our plans for the future. The link to register for that is also in the chat. And then finally, it's members like all of you who power all of our campaigns. If you'd like to become a member today with either a one-time gift or by setting up a monthly gift, you can do that at the link in the chat. And since we don't take any corporate funding, every dollar counts. And that is all for today. As I mentioned, we recorded today's conversation, so I will be emailing that out tomorrow. And just one final thank you for all that you do for Food and Water Watch and to protect our planet. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.